Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Problem with Authority podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten Kelly, and today we are going to dive into the topic of problems with medical racism. So, a few months back for my women's issues class, I read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And for those of you interested in medicine or just interested to learn more about the history of medical racism in general, and don't get me wrong, medical racism still occurs to this day, but this is a really great book that dives into the history of it and specifically through the story of Henrietta Lacks. And I'm just going to read the little section under the title here on the book. It says, "Doctors took her cells without asking. Those cells never died. They launched a medical revolution in a multi-million-dollar industry, and more than 20 years later, her children found out their lives would never be the same." And this is by the author Rebecca Skloot. She was, I think, a reporter and went in and just tackled this story, interviewed family members, and tried to help family members of Henrietta's get the truth about what happened with her and her cells. And Rebecca is a white woman, so that was addressed in the book on how, the family didn't trust her. Like, why should they? Because they had been approached multiple times before for interviews and different things like that. And the family members were like, well, I don't see any money. They were like, we need to sue. People would try and come after the family and scam them. And the sad thing of it all was that the family really didn't understand the impact that her cells had. So there was a misconception with Henrietta's daughter where she thought that her mom was still alive in a sense. And she thought that, the experiments and stuff that they were doing with the cells was hurting her mom. And this caused so much stress and anxiety and health problems for the family because of the turmoil that they went through with this story. And it's very interesting, but really sad. And I think that white people, and specifically, would really benefit reading this novel just to gain some more insight, on the privilege they have, especially when it comes to being treated medically and the rights that they have compared to people of color. So let's dive right in. When I read this book, we had to do 2 book critiques on it and then a PowerPoint presentation in a group. So I'm going to read my part of the presentation to you all. And I know that I've been so bad with uploading episodes to this podcast. I'm still here. I still love this podcast and I still want to do it. I'm just in a huge kind of life transition, I guess, right now. I'm in my final internship before I graduate with my MSW. I am working and interning, and there has just been a lot that has gone on. And I think for me, making that transition from full-time student to full-time worker / intern when I still kind of have student responsibilities of, I have a capstone I have to write and different things like that. It's kind of hard to balance it all. And I definitely felt overwhelmed because I didn't really get a break from the end of spring semester to the start of my internship in May. And I think my weekends, I just really needed to rest and I needed to have fun and I needed to party so that I can recharge myself for the following week and give, all that I could to my clients and, the people that I interact with. So I'm back. Things have calmed down a little bit and I'm still in love with podcasting. I still want to use it as a way to hold myself accountable to continuing to educate myself. I am reading the book Ace right now, which I'm really excited to do an episode on. It is about asexuality and, the difference between sexual desire and attraction and how, society is obsessed with sex and how that can hurt a lot of us. And it's really amazing. I have so many highlighted sections and notes for that one. So that'll probably be coming out soon. But yeah, let's just jump right into it. And So my section, when I did this PowerPoint presentation, was on medical racism and the patriarchy, and how they definitely overlapped during this time period. I gave you a little background on Henrietta. So Henrietta Lacks was a young woman who had cervical cancer, and her cells literally changed. It was a medical revolution. That's not being dramatic at all. So an example of medical racism can be seen in the history of cervical cancer in general and how this form of cancer was treated. And this is what Henrietta had. And a fun little fact is that pap smears were invented by men, to help detect this type of cancer early on. But regardless, because of the lack of knowledge, a lot of women of color were either getting unnecessary hysterectomies or being treated for the cancer with literal poison called radium. Now, this poison killed women and people that came into contact with the substance. And in a lot of cases, it caused cancer, or if the women were already, dying of the cancer, it sped up that process for them. This is what happened to Henrietta. And as mentioned previously, the researchers stole from her without consent, stole her cells, and many profited off of what belonged to her and her family. So I'm going to switch to my, critique notes here for a second, just to give you a little bit more background on Henrietta and the whole thing about them stealing her cells. So she grew up in Clover, Virginia. Her family farmed tobacco fields, and she lived most of her life with her grandfather and her cousin Day, which she married and had children with. And it was interesting reading this book, learning how prevalent incest was during this time. I was not aware of that. I didn't think that I don't know, I just didn't think that was something that was that common. But even now, in a lot of rural counties that I work in, incest is still a pretty big thing. So, not sure why, but it is. So, her local doctor sent her to Johns Hopkins after her lump came back negative for syphilis. So, at this time, Hopkins was the only major hospital that treated Black patients. And because of medical neglect and racism, when she gave birth, she was also pregnant, gave birth months earlier, no one detected that she had this lump. And then 3 months later, it was a full-fledged tumor. So she was pregnant at the time this lump showed up. Nobody cared. Nobody decided to check or, do anything about it. And then later it was a tumor. And so at Johns Hopkins, you have these doctors and researchers. One is named Dr. Linde, probably not pronouncing that right, and Dr. Gay, who they would go through whatever unethical lengths possible to become famous trailblazers within their field. Definitely racist, definitely hate women, all the above, right? So Henrietta ended up getting her tumor procedure to treat the cancer at the same hospital that these men were carrying out experiments. And both men were collecting samples of cervix tissues of women who had tumors without their consent. And so this was happening to all of the women that were in that hospital. And in chapter 4, we learn how the stolen cells named HeLa, which are Henrietta cells, grew, unlike the other cells the doctors collected. So part of the recipe needed to incubate the cells included umbilical cord blood, which they would also steal from women in the hospital without their consent. So that's just a little bit of a background of, why her cells were stolen, what was going on, how these doctors are terrible, terrible, terrible people, and how and nobody really, there was never an explanation as to why her cells were the ones that replicated and just kept growing and growing and growing. And I can't even explain to you in words the magnitude of what her cells did. Like, they were transported everywhere. They were used in so many different experiments. And there was no credit to Henrietta. She was not viewed as a person at all. That is the background. So let's move on to, or back to, like, the presentation and, focus on the medical racism. In a lot of cases, I was talking about the radium, of them using that to treat the cervical cancer for women. And this is what happened to Henrietta. So she was treated with radium. And as mentioned previously, the researchers stole from her without consent, and many profited off of what belonged to her and her family. So I talked a little bit about Johns Hopkins. So here's a little background on that. Hopkins was where Henrietta was treated, and at this time, Hopkins was the only major hospital that treated Black patients, which is crucial for this time period as it was the era of Jim Crow. And white-only hospitals would not accept Black patients and would often let them, like, die in the parking lot. So even if they showed up, they wouldn't help them at all. However, this made the hospital a target for medical racism and unethical treatment. It's not like they had Black doctors in there treating Black patients. It was white doctors doing all types of messed up stuff. And Henrietta explained, because she kept a lot of journals. And there was also, which is interesting, like, the importance, I'm in social work, the importance of documentation, right? And also how that overlaps with the importance of medical documentation, because she reported that she was not okay and the doctors would not believe her. And like I said before, medical racism is still alive. It still happens. And this is one of the biggest things that I hear, especially Black women talk about when it comes to getting their medical needs met. They're telling doctors, I'm not okay, I'm in pain, and doctors don't believe them. So that's what happened to Henrietta. The doctors would not believe her. So because of medical neglect and racism, like I said, when she gave birth, no one detected that she had the lump, and then it was a tumor. So Henrietta had to go as far as giving herself a cervix exam in her bathtub to locate the tumor, because she knew she could trust herself better than a doctor. When I read that part, that really hit me, because I was like, wow. Like, wow. Like, she really did that, because she can't trust the doctors. And I will never know what that feels like, to feel that I have to take my medical worries into my own hands because I can't trust a doctor. When we read about Henrietta's medical history, we learn how she, had a lot of concerns regarding her health, but Henrietta explained that the doctors would speak to her in terms she did not understand, and how Black patients only went to Hopkins when they thought they had no other choice. So this hospital, treated Black patients, but it's not like, obviously, like I said, like, there's still white doctors in there. So unless they thought it was life or death, like, they weren't going in there. Now, I did a little bit of background research more into, like, medical racism, and I found this book by Henrietta Washington. I have not read this book, but I read an article on it and what she dives into, and I think it gives other, prominent examples of medical racism kind of around this time period. So she recounts the history of medical racism from the Tuskegee study, where numerous experiments occurred on Black Americans in slavery performed by white doctors and researchers. The Henrietta book only accounts for, like, a few examples of medical racism, but this book dives into the career of James Marion Sims, who is the father of American gynecology, who purchased numerous females who were in slavery to experiment on at his plantation clinic in Alabama. And these experiments on these women, Black women, women of color, eventually led to medical benefits for white women. And, just from a feminist perspective and, like, intersectionality, just, I just, wow, like, I don't have words. Like, that one really hits me too. Like, these the experiments on these Black women eventually led to medical benefits for white women. Like, just take that in, listeners. Just take that in. Just take that in. All right. Another example was Columbia University's 1992 study to try and establish a link between genetics and violence. And in order to do this study, they obtained subjects who were either Black or Hispanic. And the researchers approached parents of children between the ages of 6 and 10 who had older brothers in the state's probation system. So right there, I mean, honestly, where we were when we started with, a link between genetics and violence, that, this wasn't going to be going to a very, very ethical place. And the parents were told that their sons were going to undergo a safe test to discover if they might have any medical problems, which was not true. The children were instead subjected to doses of the drug, excuse me, I'm going to say this wrong, my medical professionals out there, fenfluramine, which is a component of a drug that has been banned. So that's another example of what researchers and doctors would do. Even today, it's still kind of like the whole, as long as we're doing things ethically, IRB approved, whatever, it's fine. But still, when it comes to that cultural competency part of things, or really listening to the people, to the like research participants, I still feel that a lot of the times their needs and concerns are neglected. It's not to this level, obviously, but I don't feel that we're fully there yet. That's just my opinion. Okay, so now we're going to go into the whole thing about informed consent. So the topic of informed consent is huge in this book because of just the unethical and illegal, well, I mean, it wasn't illegal at the time, but definitely illegal now, things that researchers and doctors would do. They would experiment on people, they would take things from them, they would leave them to die, all of the above. So the beginning of medical researchers getting informed consent started with research conducted by Chester Southam and Emmanuel Mandel, where they injected participants with HeLa cancer cells, which were Henrietta cells, without their knowledge in order to study if/how cancer developed in sick and healthy patients. And the NIH got involved and started demanding that researchers get informed consent, because that's fucked up. You can't just do that. To no surprise, researchers were mad. And this is happening in America. This is happening in America right now, okay? And the researchers were mad and they started crying, about how they were quote unquote different than the Nazis who experimented on Jewish people. And that situation is what sparked the creation of the Numeric Code, a 10-point code of ethics that governs all human experimentation worldwide. Now, this code at the time was not a law, so humans were still left unprotected. So I feel like that's a thing that I see often here, especially because we learned a lot growing up about the Holocaust and what the terrible things that the Nazis did to Jewish people. And I definitely think that needs to be, everybody needs to be made aware of that. We need to know that history. But I just think it's interesting that in education, because right now there's a lot of things on the news talking about how all the dumbasses that run shit said that critical race theory is not allowed to be taught in schools. And so that just, I think, perpetuates that whole thing of like American school system being like, hey, look what those people did over there in a different country, and completely neglecting all of the terrible and very similar things that have been done in this country over here. And that's not okay. People need to be fully educated and informed, because then you're just perpetuating, white supremacy and all of that. But I think that's a really good example of I guess, the way that America manipulates and wants to continue to perpetuate white supremacy. Whew. Okay. So now we're moving into the patriarchy. And the patriarchy plays a huge part in this time period because men were the ones controlling science, medicine, and research. And I put in here and essentially women's bodies because that is true. Women still did not have a lot of rights at this time, even white women, even though they definitely had more than women of color. But men were calling all the shots, which is honestly like when I heard that like men created the pap smear, I was it out of the kindness of their heart? Probably not. They just wanted credit for being, smart or whatever. But I also think too, like I had, my gynecology appointment last week. This might be TMI, but I was just thinking, like with my sister, I was like, do men have to go through like a similar procedure as a pap smear to make sure that they don't get cancer in their area? Like why do we do this? Like why is our health just so concerning for everybody? Like I know it's good that, people care about our health, but it didn't really come from a very, feminist, we love women place. So I always just think about that. Like, like because every day, we wake up as women and our rights are being debated in the news, and it's just like back the fuck off, Oh, it's exhausting. This world is exhausting. And then also too, all of our trans women out there having to wake up and see that people are banning them from playing sports. Disgusting. Like just to wake up every day and see that your rights as a human are up for debate, it is exhausting. And anybody that's listening that's really struggling with that, just know that all your feelings are valid and just take a fucking break. Put down the phone. It's not fair, it's not right. But all I can say is like, I'm sorry. That's literally all I can say right now. But there are people that are trying to, get that shit to stop. All right. I'm a little off track. Okay, so one of the biggest things in the book that you saw with the scientists and the researchers was that they would lie to the press and the media about how they treated Henrietta and that she gave informed consent when she did not. So media plays such a huge role in everything. And I think that was one of my favorite parts about this book was just watching how the media manipulated everything. And we see it to this day. We have people walking around believing dumb shit because of the media. And honestly, like my parents, like my mom will come to me and say, "Oh, like did you hear this?" And I'm like, "That's not true. Like don't believe that." And I have to sit here and like put out fires everywhere because I'm like, "No. Like, where did you get that?" And media is literally used to manipulate. It can be used to be great, but I wish there was more education around, consuming media, just like how to consume media, how to, check your sources and different things like that. But I mean, that sucks because like not everybody has, the ability or access to do that or time for that matter. But that'd be a really interesting discussion or class or something like that, right? But anyway, so yeah, they were liars, of course, no surprise there. And the male doctors would experiment and take samples from women of color and poor women to help white women. Yeah, that's what they would do. The doctors would lie on women patient medical records about how the women were feeling and what they reported. So if a woman said, "Hey, I don't feel good, I think something's wrong," doctors would lie and be like, "Patient says she's great." No. And women during this time were also more likely to be sent to psychiatric hospitals, where a whole other set of unethical things took place, such as experimentation, assault, rape, and abuse. And I mean, I do not doubt that those things, happened in the medical world, but I do know for a fact that that has happened in psychiatric hospitals. And we talked about that in the problem with women in prison episode, how they were more likely to be sent to psychiatric hospitals and not be seen as humans, and then also sexualize that. Very, very interesting. And unfortunately, so Henrietta did have a daughter named Elsie, and I think she had some type of disability or special need, and she was, they didn't, at the time, they were very, discriminatory against people that had disabilities, and she was sent to a psychiatric hospital. And in the book, later on, it talks about Elsie's story, because Henrietta's other daughter, Deborah, wanted to know like what happened to her, because nobody would talk about Elsie and nobody would talk about her mom, Henrietta. And it's likely that she experienced those things after being able to get access from the psychiatric hospital's medical records. So many people in their family experienced just horrendous and unethical, treatment, not only because they are Black, but also because they were women. And even within the family, the things with the incest and the assault that they would experience from their own cousins and siblings was hard to read at times. But I definitely recommend this book for anybody that is looking to learn more about this topic. And I think that's it. This doesn't even cover half of it. There's so many little parts in this book that are so informative, and I encourage you all to read. So that is it. Thank you all for listening to this episode. I will try to get better with posting, but like I said, I'm in a weird place right now, and it is what it is. Like it's that post. I mean, COVID is still happening, obviously, but everything's opening up and life is shifting again. And I feel like in the pandemic, because I couldn't go anywhere, this was such an amazing outlet for me. It's still an amazing outlet, but it felt different. I don't know. It felt a little different. And now I think on my weekends that I have more time to go see people and do things that I love. I don't want to take that for granted anymore, getting out of my house and socializing. So I'm trying to, again, find that balance between that and podcasting. All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and I will see you next time.